Beyond Plastics, and we have a tradition of starting our webinars with music, which either people find really wonderful and inspiring, or they're horrified by it and they never come back. This was a musical dedication sent out to Senator Joe Manchin because we all just got the news an hour or two ago that the side deal that he agreed to with Senator Schumer has been taken off the table. That was a side deal that would have promoted the Mountain Valley Pipeline and other fossil fuel projects, which we strongly opposed. So we're starting on a high note. Ain't No Mountain High Enough by the Supremes seemed very appropriate. And we're thrilled to have you today. I want to thank all of our amazing speakers who you will hear from, and particularly thank my Beyond Plastics colleague, Alexis Goldsmith, who was the key organizer of this webinar. Those of you who are new to Beyond Plastics, we're a feisty little environmental startup based at Bennington College in Vermont. We work to educate, advocate, and organize with the goal of reducing plastic pollution everywhere. And so obviously the petrochemical build out is very much linked to the problem of plastic pollution in our ocean, in our bodies. It's a health issue, it's an environmental justice issue. And it really got some great news last week down in Louisiana. A Louisiana state court judge handed an incredible victory to our friends at Rise St. James, Sharon Levine and her community, and Earth Justice sued in state court to invalidate the permits for the Formosa plastic complex, which included 2 proposed ethane crackers in St. James Parish, Louisiana. And a state judge threw out all of the permits, telling Formosa they needed to go back to the drawing board and start from the beginning. Formosa said they will likely appeal. We'll see if they actually do that. Whether or not, I think that court decision has galvanized activism all over Texas, Louisiana, Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, Kentucky, other places that are facing threats by petrochemical facilities. So let me welcome you officially on behalf of Beyond Plastics, and turn the floor over to my amazing colleague, Alexis Goldsmith.
Thank you, Judith. You all will not be hearing from me much tonight because we have such a wonderful schedule and 3 awesome speakers, all from the Ohio River Valley, Pittsburgh area. So it is really my pleasure to kick this webinar off, this meeting off, with our first speaker, Jill Hunker. Jill is a mother, teacher, an artist, a grassroots organizer, and an environmental advocate. Let me just pin Jill here if I can find her. There we go. She's a 7th generation Ohio Valley resident in Belmont County, the most heavily fracked in the state of Ohio. And due to the vast polluting oil and gas infrastructure, she was forced to relocate from her home in the Slope Creek Valley. But nevertheless, Jill is an educator, and she is relentlessly vocal about the threats from the polluting and destructive oil and gas and petrochemical industries. She helps empower people in her community and beyond to stand up for their rights for a healthy environment. And we invited her here today to share some of her story and her mission to promote peace, clean energy solutions, and a healthy and protected Mother Earth. So without further ado, Jill, take the stand.
Thank you, Alexis. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with everyone tonight. As a 7th generation Ohio Valley resident whose ancestors were stewards of the land and community service minded, I assumed the role of environmental and community advocate as soon as the oil and gas industry began development in my homelands. And the Honorable Malcolm X shared the following wisdom, which I have taken to heart and embraced. The greatest mistake of the movement has been trying to organize a sleeping people around specific goals. You have to wake the people up first, then you'll get action. That's what we're attempting to do here tonight, wake up the people. And I am grateful to Heather and Alison for sharing their wisdom, and All at Beyond Plastic for organizing this meeting. I've been educating the public and local officials about the risks of fracking for years when I learned about the planned petrochemical development for the Ohio River Valley and the Appalachian Storage Hub. I immediately started to organize and raise resistance and raise awareness about the connection between fracking and cracking to make plastic. And why should we be concerned about fracking to make plastic? Because it threatens our air, our water, and public health, and perpetuates the climate crisis. Not only will the Ohio River Valley be subjected to the pollution from a petrochemical buildout, but it will also drastically increase fracking infrastructure in the region. And, fracking has already proved to be devastating to our environment, to public health, to our air and water. And in fact, Shell's ethane cracker plant alone will require 1,000 fully functioning gas wells to feed it on an ongoing basis. Compressor stations will also increase in number, and they are a continuous source of air pollution, including volatile organic compounds, some of which are known carcinogens. And they are causing health impacts to frontline communities. I was forced from my home and am now a fracking refugee, in part because of the pollution from a compressor station that had been in ongoing and significant violations of the Clean Air Act and the Ohio Pollution Control Act, with no remediation or enforcement by the regulatory agencies. Our water supplies are also being depleted and poisoned by fracking. It takes on average 11 million gallons of fresh water to frack one well. The industry is taking water from our rivers, ponds, and streams and permanently contaminating it with toxic chemicals and radioactive elements, which are brought to the surface in the flowback during the fracking process. This toxic water is then injected back into the ground for disposal, threatening our aquifers. I'm living in a sacrifice zone due to the polluting and poorly regulated oil and gas industry. And now the petrochemical industry wants to invade and create even more toxic air and water pollution in the Ohio River Valley. The regulating agencies have already failed to protect communities from air and water pollution, and now are promoting cracking to make plastic, which is the last thing this beautiful planet needs. Companies are trying to secure federal support for these petrochemical projects in the form of loan guarantees from the Department of Energy. This cannot be allowed to happen. We must embrace a better vision for Appalachia as we move forward, creating renewable energy economies and regenerative agricultural development for a brighter future. Grandmother Twyla was a wisdom keeper with the Seneca clan, with the Wolf clan of the Seneca Nation, actually, and she was revered all over the world and was even visited by the Dalai Lama at one time. Her instructions were based on how to live with harmony with nature and how to walk peacefully with all creatures. She helped people understand our connection to our Earth Mother and how we should honor all the creatures of the earth. A very important concept she shared was that all people, all creatures, all manifestations on earth belong to one universal family. In other words, we are one body, one heart, one mind, and one spirit. All things are created equal. Human beings have no dominion over any other creatures on earth. In fact, human beings would not exist if it wasn't for all the other creatures. This is a great interrelationship, and we love it because we are part of a great whole, and we cannot in any way ever be separated from it. To secure a healthy future for our children, love for the earth, for our environment with clean air and water must be our motivation and the foundation in the work that lies ahead. Our actions must not be based on fear of climate change, but rather on the love for all we hold dear. I will conclude with these words spoken by Grandmother Twyla. What seems to hold the majority of people on earth is fear, helpless negativism, lifeless energy, futility, and so on. Always smile because smiling sends out a happy energy and helps to heal pent-up hurt. It is healthy to smile because it releases energy that is stuck. That is why a hearty laugh is the best medicine. Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Jill, for opening tonight's event and setting the stage for the presentations. And now we're going to go to Alison Steele. Alison is the Executive Director of the Environmental Health Project, a nonprofit organization in the Pittsburgh area that defends public health in the face of shale gas development. EHP recently released a comprehensive white paper on Pennsylvania's shale gas boom and how policy decisions have failed to protect public health and what can be done to correct it. So without further ado, go ahead, Alison.
Thank you so much. Thanks everybody from the Beyond Plastics team. Thank you, Jill, for your words. I'm honored to be among such great company this evening. And I'm going to share my slides here. I think those should be up for everybody to see. Are those great?
Yep.
All right. I am going to just run through very quickly, just a little bit more background about EHP. We were founded in 2012 as a response to growing concerns about shale gas infrastructure in frontline communities in Southwest Pennsylvania, but our focus has grown over the years along with demand for answers about what's happening from a health standpoint and why more isn't happening from a policy standpoint. We have really worked to ensure that health considerations are part of the policy conversation, particularly where policy touches on technologies associated with the extraction and transportation and end use and disposal of the gas and associated materials with this industry. Our efforts specifically include three specific areas. One is data collection and analysis near infrastructure of concern, like the cracker. Health and wellness education that includes leading experts throughout the country on a variety of subjects, including some of the health impacts that we see around petrochemical development, and policy and advocacy initiatives through engaging decision makers at all levels of government. Tonight, I'm going to give a little bit of context about petrochemicals in Appalachia and also look back at the policy landscape of how we got here, and then wrap up with some actions that are taking place on the air quality front, both in our organization and in community groups. So first of all, the question on everybody's minds is why here, why now? And really, we're looking at two key factors that have contributed to this potential petrochemical boom in Appalachia. First of all, we are sitting on the Marcellus and Utica shale plays, which, according to the American Petroleum Institute, represent the second largest fossil gas find on the planet. So the gas is here, and that makes it easy, but also making it easy are some very industry-friendly policy decisions within Pennsylvania and the surrounding area. But that started with the beginning of the shale boom in the early 2000s, and I'll get into that in just a little bit. But more recently, specifically for petrochemical development, Pennsylvania recently gave Shell a $1.6 billion tax incentive to build the facility in our state in return for 600 ongoing jobs to run the plant. And petrochemicals and hydrogen represent a new market, two new markets for the use of this gas, which has been very dominant in the heating and power and transportation sectors. But as we look toward more renewable energies in those sectors and with a projected decline of gas as an option, certainly the industry is looking toward new markets and end uses for the gas that is extracted from the ground. And unfortunately, we know that there is a health problem related to exposure to the industry to components of the process. And as Jill mentioned, we know that more shale gas production is going to go hand in hand with petrochemical development. We know that there are extensive health impacts associated with the entire life cycle of shale gas, and you'll see a number of studies scrolling past on your screen as I talk about them, and not each one individually, but we've looked at over 70 studies examining links between various stages of shale gas development and a host of adverse health impacts, including increased risk of asthma attacks, respiratory and cardiovascular diseases, neurological problems, poor birth outcomes, and cancer. And again, as Jill mentioned, there are projections saying that in order to feed this one cracker, we're going to need 1,000 new wells drilled every 5 years. And that's just for one. If there's more petrochemical development in the region, we're going to need even more than that. And so these health impacts talk about the entire shale gas production life cycle, but to talk about numbers specifically related to the cracker, we know that there are going to be emissions that include fine particulate matter, volatile organic compounds such as benzene, sulfur dioxide, there's carbon monoxide, formaldehyde, all expected to be released from this facility. And because they are permitted to release hundreds of tons of some of these substances every year, including over 2.3 million tons of CO2. We know that there are health concerns documented in proximity to petrochemical facilities, specifically related to Cancer Alley in Louisiana. And similarly to how we proceeded at the beginning of the shale gas boom, we're seeing this again, where we're moving forward without any semblance of caution or with an eye toward potential public health impacts or a public health approach to protect the public, and particularly the public living in proximity to these facilities. And so as I look back throughout Pennsylvania's history with shale gas, there are a number of trends that have shown up in our own research and what we've seen over the years. And the first significant trend is that there is a persistent gap in between knowledge, what's known and what's done with that knowledge. If there has been a body of scientific evidence, which there now absolutely is, it is not necessarily incorporated into a policy approach. Similarly, when there's a conspicuous lack of information on the subject, as there was in the early days of the shale boom, there are few considerations for how to fill that gap, that knowledge gap, before proceeding in a more informed way. Similarly, there's a common misconception that regulations equal safety, when in fact regulations are not usually based on safety levels, but more often represent what constitutes acceptable risk for the people making the decisions. And those levels are arrived at after negotiations and can often be arbitrary. And the other aspect of that is we know that the regulations surrounding this industry are loose, but they are also, in Pennsylvania specifically, rarely enforced when there are violations that happen. And the third is, again, in the same vein, if we're talking about health impacts not being included in conversations, very often economic benefits or the promise of economic benefits have driven the conversation and really dominated the narrative, and caution around health impacts have made less of an appearance or been overshadowed. And that has happened across multiple parts of our government, certainly at the federal level. The Energy Policy Act of 2005 really opened the door for shale gas development in Pennsylvania by creating subsidies, tax benefits, and regulatory preferences for oil and gas, and also created numerous exceptions for shale gas from federal regulations, including the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, and others. And in in a very significant way, limited the EPA's regulatory powers on the subject, leaving it very much to the states to decide how they were going to proceed. And that played out in a very real way within the state legislature in Pennsylvania that created very industry-friendly legislation, making it cheap and easy to do business within the state without having to worry about public disclosure of chemical compounds that were being used. And then counter to that, counter to the very pro-industry legislation, there were also some actions by the General Assembly that set up budgetary roadblocks for progress that could have been made to better understand the issue, specifically funding a statewide health registry, making sure that agencies tasked with protecting public health and the environment had sufficient funding to mount an adequate public health response. We saw some similar actions from the governor's office as well. We've had 3 very shale-friendly gubernatorial administrations in the period of the shale boom in Pennsylvania that saw either very, very pro-shale rhetoric and support, or at the very least, a lot more that could have been done to take a vocal stance, to support the narrative of why we need a better public health approach, using the opportunity of being in that seat to push what is known about the public health risks and push the General Assembly to pass more health protective legislation and adequately fund the agencies doing that work on the regulatory side. Speaking of those agencies, we have our State Department of Environmental Protection has gotten a lot of attention over the years in a number of investigations, including a statewide grand jury investigation in 2020. But there are a lot of accounts from multiple sources noting a lack of prompt or effective response to, sorry about that. Lack of prompt response to violations or even making sure that there were meaningful responses to violators and holding them accountable. We at EHP are involved more directly with the Department of Health. And we recognize that in many ways their hands have been tied. They're not a regulatory body for oil and gas. They've had insufficient bandwidth and funding to be able to mount a meaningful response. And they have had to take their orders from 3 very shale-friendly governors. But we still want to call attention to the fact that there is more that could have been done from the standpoint of providing informational resources to frontline residents and to the physicians who treat them, calling attention to the mountain of evidence that has been compiled on the subject, and calling for more caution in the face of either known health risks or things that are unknown and require a more critical eye before simply moving forward. So with that background, and that's specifically for shale gas, but we're seeing a lot of these themes repeat themselves with the cracker and with the specter of petrochemical development in the region. So I'm going to just go into some of the specifics on what's being done to look at air quality, and Heather's going to talk about water quality in a little bit, but specifically talking about air quality around the cracker. And so first of all, the Department of Environmental Protection is doing some air toxics monitoring. They've got a station at the Beaver Valley Mall, which is downwind of the site. That involves SUMA canister collection every 6 days. And a SUMA canister is a vacuum canister that you can open up, collect an air sample, close it, and send it to a lab to get a breakdown of what chemicals are in the air. They have also set up a monitoring site across the river, which was added in 2021, that measures ozone, fine particulate matter, VOCs, and meteorological conditions. For Shell specifically, they are required to monitor and report, thanks to a settlement with the Clean Air Council and the Environmental Integrity Project, And that requires that once it's operational, will require continuous VOC monitoring that includes automatic summa canister deployment after a certain action level is reached on the monitors. And they have 4 of those stations, 1 located upwind of the site and 3 downwind. There are also passive absorption tubes to collect samples at 20 locations around the site. And that includes hazardous chemicals such as benzene. As for what's happening outside of the site itself, there is a network of community organizations located pretty much around the site itself. And they have set up a network of continuous fine particulate monitors and VOC monitors. And you can see some of them reporting various levels in all of the directions around the facility itself. And they've been set up for some time. There's some baseline monitoring that has been done since the site is not officially operational yet. We've been able to look in and see what's going on whenever there has been an event. There was a maple syrup smell earlier this year. There's been some flaring, but also in addition to the continuous monitoring that's being done, some residents have been trained to collect grab samples from the air whenever there's an event. And so finally, in addition to doing some data analysis from the monitoring network at EHP, which is something that we've done historically in frontline communities, we're also working to perform modeling of pollution and particulate and VOC dispersion based on historic wind patterns. And so what that means is that we have started looking, and we actually started this with the cracker. It was the first site that we looked at. We've been able to model relative exposure to emissions using both historic weather data and assumptions about emissions from the site, but we can actually see what areas are estimated to have higher concentrations of pollutants, which helps us inform if we're going to advise where air monitors should be placed. Some of the work that's coming up next after this is more dispersion modeling, so we can more accurately determine whether a particular monitor reading could have been influenced by the facility itself, rather than just saying this monitor near the facility is high. We can actually pinpoint and say it's high because the wind was coming in a certain direction, and we can better understand the dispersion from the site, but also looking into secondary pollutant formation that will help us to better understand how additional pollutants form in the atmosphere when interacting with each other and sunlight, which is something that has been harder to really understand in more recent years. So with that summary of the different initiatives that are taking place, I do want to wrap up with some thoughts about how EHP approaches this issue. And we really want to focus on the 4 areas of equity, transparency, authority, and accountability throughout, from making sure that residents are not the ones responsible for bearing a disproportionate health burden or being the ones responsible to fight this fight. It should be the government stepping in and agencies tasked with protecting public health, making sure that there are adequate protections for them. And in order to do that, there has to be information about the health implications of hosting this infrastructure and what's actually happening on the ground. So ensuring that there is comprehensive health-focused policy from the top, making health a priority, and making sure that there's accountability for when violations happen. And so in order to make sure that this approach is successful, I'm sure everybody on the call tonight wants to know what they can do. So whether you are living nearby this facility or one like it, or if you're anywhere else in the country. From the standpoint of if you're living nearby, absolutely make sure that you're reporting events, keeping a health diary, talking to your doctor, making sure that there's a record of what has been happening, what you've been experiencing. I will note that the University of Pittsburgh's Asthma Institute Research Registry just opened to residents of Beaver County. So that's an option as well. Also making sure that you're using an air purifier, monitoring air quality. Websites like airnow.gov can help you get a better sense of what conditions are like, but absolutely also being vocal in your local government, advocating for stronger oversight, steeper penalties, and making sure there's a record of your complaints. And then for people who are not living near these facilities, absolutely being vocal, getting in contact with the EPA, the state government, local health agencies to express your concern, getting involved with initiatives that reduce reliance on fossil fuels and plastics. Thank you, everyone with Beyond Plastics, for doing that. And thank you, everybody, for being here tonight. And just continuing to be vocal in media outlets, writing LTEs, letters to the editor, to newspapers, or just being vocal on social media and helping to shift the narrative so there is a clear perception of the health risks associated with living near these facilities. So thank you very much for your time and attention. I know there's going to be a Q&A later, but here's my contact information if you would like to get in touch with me or EHP to chat about anything after we're done tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alison, and thank you for emphasizing the need to be vocal, because certainly people being vocal relentlessly is why Senator Manchin's side deal has not gone through, and why the Formosa permits have been tossed out, or it has certainly contributed to that. So our final speaker tonight is Heather Hulton VanTassel. Heather is the executive director of Three Rivers Waterkeeper, based in Pittsburgh. And Three Rivers Waterkeeper has a very noble mission of working towards drinkable, swimmable, fishable waters for all. Heather is an environmental conservationist and is passionate about nature-based solutions that lead to the sustainability of the planet and also for equality. So Heather, where did there we go. Sorry, there we go. Go ahead, Heather.
All right. Well, I hope you all can see my screen because I can no longer see you all. But thank you so much for having me here today.
We don't see your screen actually, Heather.
Don't. Well, thank you for letting me know. Let's try this again. Is it working now?
Yes.
Awesome. Sorry about that. Well, thank you all for letting me come on today and talk to you all a little bit about Three Rivers Waterkeeper and what we're doing around the shale cracker plant here in Beaver County. Again, my name is Heather Hulton VanTassel, the executive director of Three Rivers Waterkeeper. Our mission is to protect the water quality of the Monongahela, Allegheny, and Ohio rivers and their respective watersheds. The shale cracker plant that we're talking about today is on the Ohio River. And whenever the Monongahela and Allegheny come together at Pittsburgh, they form the headwaters of the Ohio River Basin. We have that vision of drinkable, fishable, swimmable waters in our rivers and our watersheds. And what makes us unique is that we're a member of the Waterkeeper Alliance, which is a global initiative network of waterkeepers that are all working to protect the waters in their local areas. And we do this from a scientific and legal approach in order to advocate for our community and work to ensure our rivers are protected and safe to work. Our primary jurisdiction goes up to the 4th lock-in dam on each one of the rivers. And here you'll see the Ohio River, the Monongahela River, and the Allegheny River. So we don't operate in a political boundary within Pennsylvania, but rather we work in a watershed boundary. And so what we do in our region is we have programs that are on the water, and this is where we do river patrolling, pollution response, water quality monitoring, and working to understand what is happening in our waterways. We work in the community to empower them. We do that through community events, education, outreach, and all kinds of work that really work to connect people to their waterways and create a positive experience in order for us all to come together to protect one of our most precious resources, which is water. And what we do then is protect our waters through advocacy. And this is where we really focus on our clean water law enforcement, and we hold polluters accountable where we need to. And what that looks like is we take our evidence from our on the water programs, so that's the data-driven side. We work with our communities on making sure we hold polluters accountable where they're most needed to take action. And so in order to hold polluters accountable, we first have to prevent the pollution. And this is the best way to hold them accountable. And this is where we focus on rulemakings, comments, hearings, permits that are called NIPDs, that really prevent effluent discharges into our waterways, so reducing the amount of pollution that can come from, an outfall industry or stormwater drainage, and working at zoning permit monitoring as well. We enforce current regulations, so thinking about our clean water laws, such as the Clean Water Act, PA Clean Stream laws. We do legal research, and we pressure our regulators to hold polluters accountable. We also work to decrease pollution allowances. Oftentimes, rulemakings that set limits to the amount of pollutants that are allowed in our waters are outdated, or there's better data out there to suggest better recommendations. And we work to push those when the rulemakings come up. And finally, we hold polluters accountable through litigation. And that's when all other areas have failed and our waterways are still being polluted. And we use that evidence-based approach from our monitoring and data collection and working with our empowered communities to go after our polluters in the courts. And so that brings us today about something that we're really working strong to make sure that we reduce the amount of pollution in our waterways at the ethane cracker plant, shale cracker plant. And so before we get started, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about ethane cracking. And what you see here is we first need to create the natural gas that's going to be going into the ethane cracker. And when Alison was talking about the ethane cracker plant coming on board and this build out that's going out in the Ohio River Basin, it's problematic because it's going to require a lot more natural gas, which means it's going to promote more wells being drilled in our region to actually have the the natural gas that will produce the plastics. So once we have the ethane from the fracking, we go to the ethane cracker, and under high temperatures and pressure, it's broken down into ethylene, which is the building block of most plastics. And that ethylene is then used to produce a wide variety of nurdles. And these nurdles are tiny microplastics that will actually be shipped off somewhere else and formed into your everyday plastics, whether it's single-use or multi-use products. And where we're going to see that along the Ohio River is here, which is Beaver County Ethane Cracker, which is what we're going to be talking about today. But there's an additional 4 proposed sites along the Ohio River Basin. And the first one is going to be operational any day now. And that's the Beaver County Ethane Cracker. And they spew large amounts of air pollutants. And there's just a list of them. I'm not going to go over each one and all their impacts. But combined, they can create a lot of health problems for the community. Alison dove deep into a lot of the air issues. And so I'm going to focus a little bit more on the water. That's because water and air are intrinsically connected. First, air pollution can deposit in our waterways. There's more and more evidence that shows a lot of the pollution that is in our waterways can come directly from the air. We can get direct discharges into the water, and that is where that discharge permit is really important to pay attention to, and we're going to talk a little bit about their discharge permit in a moment. For the Shell ethane cracker plant here in Pittsburgh, here in Beaver County, we're really concerned about the total dissolved solid limits, as well as the organics that are going to be pumped into our waterways. Not to mention that the ethane cracker plant in Beaver County was built on an old zinc smelting plant, and there's a lot of heavy metal contamination already on the landscape. And that land was supposed to be remediated in order to reduce the amount of metals from old industrial pollution entering our waterways. And as a reminder, this is on the Ohio River. And the Ohio River actually provides the source drinking water for nearly 5 million people. We also have nurdles that are most likely going to enter our waterways. The shale cracking plants that are already up and running in other parts of the world has had a lot of nurdle pollution. And one of their arguments for Shell is that why would they allow their product that they're trying to make for profit to enter their waterways? Well, we all know there's a margin, right? There's a margin that everyone's willing to lose, that they write off in the actual budgeting. And so for them to say that they won't lose a single nurdle is not really a great way that makes us feel confident if they don't have a plan to actually prevent the nurdle loss. And we just have to take it at their word that they just don't want to lose them. And we can't forget that there's increased noise and light pollution from this massive shell cracker plant. And that noise and light pollution can impact both people's livelihood as well as wildlife. And one thing that's really not talked about that much is how much noise and light can impact a person's ability to sleep, which can decrease their lifespan. There's going to be an increase in transportation needs. They're going to be needing to haul in a lot of natural gas. They're going to be wanting to haul out a lot of nurdles. And these microplastics contain a mix of harmful chemicals, and they've been found virtually every corner of our Earth. And there's an estimated 230,000 tons of nurdles that wind up in oceans every day. And we're just going to further build out these shell cracker plants along the Ohio to increase that. There's also going to be that increased fracking pressure that both Alison and I alluded to earlier. And it's going to impact our public environmental health. We're most likely going to potentially see increases in cancers, neurological problems, chronic health problems, drinking water contamination, and habitat degradation. And I want to really emphasize that drinking water contamination, because what's most likely going to happen is we're going to start seeing stricter guidelines for drinking waters around the Ohio River basin. But the thing is, that just means that the ratepayer, the utility payer, you yourselves are going to pay to clean the water from the cracker plants along the Ohio River, where they're allowed to just dump pollutants into our waterways. So not only you're paying it with health, whether it's chronic health problems, shortened lifespans, increased health expenses, but potentially our water utilities could increase because of the amount of extra work they have to do to clean out our waterways. And I'm also going to show you a little picture of the nurdles as well, because when I talk about habitat degradation, there's also going to be potentially these nurdles that are entering our waterways. They're really small. And if you look there, they look just like fish eggs. So these micro pellets here are actually most likely going to be consumed by fish, other wildlife, birds. They're going to ingest them. They can't pass it through their digestive system and can pass away that way. There's more and more evidence showing that these nurdles, these micro pellets of plastic, can actually soak up toxins that are already in the waterways and then be leached once consumed, or bring different toxins to different parts of the world. So I mentioned that there was a zinc smelting plant on this now ethane cracking plant. How did that happen? Well, in 2008, fracking began in Pennsylvania. 2012, Shell announces a Pennsylvania site and got the $1.6 billion tax break from our administration at the time. Shell begins pre-construction in 2015 on the old zinc smelting site and tries to transfer the Horsehead, or the zinc smelting, stormwater permit. So DEP, or Department of Environmental Protection, decided that they could transfer that permit. They didn't have to apply for a new one, even though it's a completely different process and a completely different plant. And a grandfathered shell under the zinc permit, what they were already allowed to have, plus additional things. And they started that major construction at the same time. And while they're doing that construction, they did have to remediate because of the amount of metals already on the landscape. 2018, they amended. 2019, they applied for a renewal. 2021, the permit was indeed renewed. So how did Shell sneak in that Horsehead plant and transfer it rather than doing a new one? And that's important because all those old regulations were grandfathered in, and it made it an extremely easy, streamlined process to get that permit. And I do want to mention, during that process, there was a lot of community members and environmental organizations who spoke out against this transfer and really wanted stricter regulations about what could go into our air and water. But ultimately, it went through because the American Chemistry Council estimated nearly 18,000 permanent jobs, nearly 2,500 being directly to the plant. The Trade Association estimated 11,000 construction jobs would be created. Well, in a March email, Shell spokesman Joe Minette stated that the Beaver County plant employed approximately 6,000 people with 600 full-time jobs once the facility is fully operational. That's drastically different than what was promised. And at what cost? So Shell ranks in the top 10 among the 90 companies that are responsible for the 2/3 of historic greenhouse gases. And they're not even operational. And we've already seen violations to both the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. And so are we looking at a new sacrifice zone, a new cancer alley in Beaver County? Well, I hope not, because we're here to monitor that water. And we're going to work our hardest to make sure that we don't turn into that place. And so I want to talk about some of the water quality monitoring that we have been doing. And I really want to preface that this is not us alone. There's so many organizations working on water quality issues around the Shell cracker plant. The Beaver County Marcellus Awareness Community, Mountain Watershed Association, No Petro PA, the Clean Air Council, Breathe Project, University of Pittsburgh's Water Collaborative, Three Rivers Quest at West Virginia University. And there's quite a few of those collaboratives that were mentioned that house a whole bunch of other organizations working really hard to prevent, this community becoming a sacrifice zone. Our water quality monitoring is on these pins, which we have one on the Beaver River, one on the Ohio River, and this is the Shell cracker plant. So those are upstream. Downstream, we have one at Raccoon Creek, which there's a major tributary just below it. Another one at Raccoon Creek, and one down at the next lock and dam downstream. And so what we're monitoring is for nurdles, which you can see little pellets there to understand how many nurdles are already in the waterways. We're collecting those water quality samples at those locations, really focusing on organics and understanding the baseline of what the water quality is before they get operational. And a lot of visual assessments. You can actually see a lot of water quality issues if you're just paying attention. So have they been good neighbors? Have they held up to their promises? Well, in September 2021, they had a sickly sweet maple syrup smell from the site that notified regulatory agencies, and they received a violation for malodorous air contaminants. In March 2022, a piece of faulty equipment resulted in a spill of 2,500 gallons of sulfuric acid. No violations were actually issued. In July, August, and September, we had foam discharges from the main outfall numerous times, and this is a clear violation of their permit that they have for direct discharges into our waterways. Shell claims that no harmful chemicals were put into there, and they're just simple surfactants such as Simple Green and ZEP. We can argue that those are not non-harmful. In fact, when you have surfactants, when They get in the gills of certain fish and other animals that breathe through gills. What happens is their gills can no longer pull out those dissolved oxygen in the waterways, and they can suffocate underwater. And we're also finding all of a sudden micro nurdles, so really tiny nurdles that are odd shaped, that are directly next to the plant, but not upstream, not downstream. And they claim that it can't be them because they're not in production. Even though we know they're starting to produce, they're flaring. They might be not doing the whole process of creating nurdles, and they might not be creating them for commercial purposes yet, but we know it's them. And so what we're doing now for those last few items that have really impacted our waterways is really putting pressure on our DEP to hold them accountable. We're doing a lot of investigations, a lot of requesting information, and making sure that they know that we're watching, and they can't just operate and put anything into our waterways just because it's easy for them. And so I'm going to quickly go through, what we're finding for the results of the water quality, because you'll just see a bunch of NDs, which is not detectable. So this is really great for us. Our water quality, the baseline before they're operational, is good. Non-detectable issues of organics and aromatic hydrocarbons. This is a great place to start off. We know that if we start seeing spikes in these problems with these toxic chemicals, that we feel more confident we know where it's coming from. We're also finding those tiny nurdles. So there's some pictures. If you look deep inside here, you'll see there's some wonky ones, some really small ones. And that's, to me, evidence that they're starting to produce, but not the way they want to. Here's a picture of the foam that I mentioned. And I want you to realize that Shell really thought this was a visual problem. They kept apologizing for the disruption in the visual appearance because foam is visually not appealing at all. However, what they wanted to do is just remove the foam and really ignore the impacts of that chemical being in the waterways. And I want you to think about when you wash your dishes and everything foams up. If you just removed the foam from the top, would you still drink the water? No, because there's plenty of soap in your dishwater that hasn't foamed up. So imagine how much is actually in the waterways, and that foaming is merely just from the turbulent water as it flows out of their outfall.
Heather, we're running out of time here. If you're able to wrap up.
Sure. I'm just going to throw out some things if you want to help support us. We have a cruise celebrating 50 years of the Clean Water Act, where we talk about the strengths and the challenges. We have some events, and follow us on our socials.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So, wow, that was a deep dive, I think, into the policy and permitting of these facilities. I wonder if we could, I'm gonna let people come off mute in just a minute, and I'll unlock the chat also, but if we could just take a step back. We know that the ethane crackers, they use ethane gas from fracking to produce plastics in these giant petrochemical facilities. But can you talk a little bit about, you or Alison, talk a bit about what is coming out of these facilities in terms of their products? What are they actually doing all of this for?
Money.
Yeah, so they're making those nurdles, those like precursors to plastic. So anything that is made of plastic that's around you, whether it's a single-use or multi-use plastic, well, eventually one time came from a nurdle. And so they create these tiny little nurdles, and they ship them off to another facility to be melted down and shaped into the plastics that we all know today and use in our home.
So it goes from the fracking CAD through a new pipeline to the ethane cracker, and this shell cracker is expected to open any day now.
So if anyone has questions in these last few minutes, you're welcome to unmute or put them in the chat.
I got a question through the chat asking if the PowerPoint slides are going to be made available. Is that something that you can do on your end?
Yes, if we have the link for them. And then Heather, you mentioned that 4 additional ethane crackers could be built along the Ohio River. Can you talk a little bit about what the potential cumulative impacts of 4 additional crackers would be in the region?
Yeah, I'm going to preface this by, unfortunately, with permits, typically the cumulative impacts are not taken in consideration. These are siloed permits, and oftentimes each plant goes through a series of permits, and that's also why it makes it really easy, quote unquote, for them to get processed, because nothing's ever looked as a whole. The whole build out isn't looked at, nor is each individual plant looked at as a whole. Right? Each permit is looked at separately. And so that becomes a challenge. The cumulative impacts, we see that down in Louisiana with their, what they call Cancer Alley. And so I really recommend people going and looking that up afterwards, because that's a whole deep dive that maybe we don't have time for today. I will say they're proposed. One benefit that these proposed sites are actually new sites, so their permitting process will be a lot more challenging than the shale cracker plant up in Beaver County, which went with an amended transferred permit. And so I really strongly recommend the Ohioans that are going to be impacted by these, that you become as vocal as you can be, because the cumulative impacts will not be in consideration. And each person that gets their drinking water downstream, it can be really drastic for that impact. And because these are carcinogens that are going to be coming out of the byproducts, it's really important that you try to protect your health and become vocal against what could happen in your region.
Thank you, Jill. Heather, and somebody asked if you could redisplay your contact information on the screen. Any other questions in these last few moments?
Hi, I just had a quick question. Could you explain again about the maple syrup smell? Is that something industries do to hide when they're doing a release, or how does that work?
It's just a particular compound that was released into the air, smelled like maple syrup to a lot of folks. So you'll actually find a lot of organics. They smell like things you're used to, like things can have banana smells, things can have maple syrup smells. They're often in the sweet range. And so that was just the chemical that was released into the air, had a maple syrup smell to some people.
There's a question on how the nurdles will be transported out of the site.
Yeah, so that will most likely be by train. Now trucks and barges are definitely an option, but here in our region, train is a really great way to transport materials, and there's potentially some double-decker transportation as well, where you stack one on the other. Recently, we had a derailment on the Allegheny, and nurdles were released into our waterways that way because they were actually using them as buffer cars between petroleum products to reduce the chance of an explosion. Normally they should be like empty, but they found a loophole that if they just put them with non-explosive nurdles, they can still move product and then fulfill that requirement of not having that much volatile product being shipped in one space. And so train will most likely be the major issue, which is going to also increase noise. Our infrastructure for trains are old, so we can ask that question if we have the actual infrastructure to adequately transport these materials. And then, you just want to really pay attention to how much more transportation of trains we're going to need in the area and what kind of impact noise and on infrastructure we're going to have.
Kim Cameron, go ahead.
Yeah, my question has to do with the volatiles. What kind of scrubbers are there, and what volatiles are they expecting to release at this point? I kind of live in upstate New York, so if you think about the flow of air, it will go in our direction. So I'd like to know what's up there.
I actually have a list that didn't make it into my presentation because I had to cut. But as far as what they're permitted to release, we're looking at 154 tons of ammonia, 329 tons of nitrous oxides, 407 tons of fine particulates, 612 tons of VOCs, so grouped into that, 984 tons of carbon monoxide, and over 2.3 million tons of CO2. So that's just what they're permitted to release.
Okay, thanks very much.
And just a couple more questions. Sorry, I know we're running long, but what is the expected life of the plant, and will any of their permits be revisited after a number of years or with new information? Heather or Alison?
I don't know the life expectancy off the top of my head. I will say that all permits have to be renewed on a regular basis. And if they are putting in new things into the water and air that's being found, they have to add those items to the permit. It is more challenging to dispute or ask for a denial for a renewal than it is for a new permit. But I'll let Alison add anything to that if she knows more.
I do not, but thank you.
And we'll take one more question here. This is an interesting question. Is there any hope in the political realm to elect candidates that are more environmentally friendly in order to push legislation that will stop future plants?
That is the question, Becca. I can say, for those of you not familiar with the region, there is a very strong tie to industry, particularly extractive industries. It's very tied to the regional identity, where we have really produced for the nation, whether it's energy or steel. And so there is still this perception that there will be economic benefits, that there will be another boom tied to whether it's petrochemicals or blue hydrogen hub or continued extraction of this gas, and that will continue to bolster the region. There have been economic studies done showing that the opposite has happened, that jobs and population have dropped with the advent and introduction of this industry. And so to answer that question, I think the greatest hope of electing candidates that are more environmentally friendly requires helping to shift the perception in the minds of the candidates that environmental action is necessary and something that their constituents want.
Are there anything to add to that?
No, I think Alison's right. There's always hope, but people have to vote and people have to be vocal about it. It is challenging with the amount of misinformation and the promise of economic development. I think until we can realize that the economic impact on our public health, we shouldn't have to put a dollar on our bodies, but unfortunately the world we live in, we do. And so people ignore the long-term health impacts. We don't have universal health care. This is coming directly out of your pocket. We don't have free water. This, to clean it, it's going to come out of your pocket. We don't have free things in our society. And so there's oftentimes over promises of economic boom and not enough discussion on the economic impact that happens when you have environmental health issues, loss in people who wanting to stay in the region, loss of recreation dollars that come after you have such a big impact on your environment and community health.
Jill, do you have anything that you want to comment on?
I'm really grateful that I was able to participate tonight, and definitely excellent job on the presentations. I thought I knew a little, but I learned a lot more this evening, so I'm really grateful. Thank you both.
So thank you everyone for sticking with us. We'll close at 8:05. You're going to receive a follow-up email tomorrow with the contact information for Environmental Health Project and Three Rivers Waterkeeper. Plus, we'll include the links to the presentations, which Heather and Alison, if you could send me those tonight, then I'll be able to put those in there. So thank you everyone for coming, and we'll say good night.
Thank you so much.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you for hosting. This was great.
Good night.
Thank you.
I'm
Amazing
in
women.
Pittsburgh. Sorry.
Thank you so
Sorry.
much.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
And Andrew, I think you actually have the power to end the stream.